Brooklyn. The name alone conjures images of brownstone buildings, tree-lined streets, vibrant neighborhoods, and the unmistakable energy of New York City life. But beneath the surface of this iconic borough lies a darker reality, a collection of stories so bizarre, so shocking, that they challenge our understanding of fate itself. What you're about to hear are not the tales of calculated murders or planned tragedies. These are stories of death arriving in the most unexpected, most unbelievable ways possible. 6 lives, 6 deaths, 6 moments when the streets of Brooklyn became the stage for the unthinkable. From nightlife districts to quiet residential blocks, from moments of celebration to ordinary afternoons, death came calling in ways no one could have predicted. This is not fiction. These events happened on real streets, to real people, in one of America's most famous boroughs. Prepare yourself, because what follows will shake your perception of safety, coincidence, and the thin line between life and death. The streets of Brooklyn stretch across 71 square miles, home to more than 2.5 million people. Every day, millions of footsteps echo across its sidewalks. Most journeys end safely at home, at work, at destinations reached without incident. But for the 6 individuals you'll hear about today, their final steps on Brooklyn streets led to deaths so strange, so unexpected, that they left investigators, families, and entire communities searching for answers that may never fully come. These are the stories that haunt the collective memory of a borough, tales whispered about in bars and shared in hushed tones, reminders that sometimes reality is far stranger and more terrifying than any horror story we could imagine. The summer of 2023 arrived in Brooklyn with the promise of endless nights and unforgettable memories. For 27-year-old Karl Clemente, June should have been just another chapter in the story of his youth, filled with friends, music, and the kind of carefree moments that define our 20s. Karl was the kind of person everyone wanted around, charismatic, full of life, always ready with a smile or a joke that could turn any gathering into a celebration. On that warm June evening, he and his friends made plans to hit one of Brooklyn's hottest nightlife spots, the Brooklyn Mirage in East Williamsburg. The Brooklyn Mirage wasn't just any club. Situated in the industrial landscape of East Williamsburg, this massive outdoor venue had become legendary in New York's electronic music scene. With its open-air dance floor that could hold thousands, cutting-edge sound systems, and performances by world-renowned DJs, it was the kind of place where memories were made, where the music pulsed through your body until sunrise. For Karl and his friends, it was supposed to be another perfect night in a perfect summer. They arrived full of anticipation, ready to lose themselves in the rhythm and the crowd. But Karl never made it past the front door. Security guards at the entrance took one look at Karl and made a decision that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. They determined he was too intoxicated to enter safely. It was a judgment call, the kind made at nightclub entrances thousands of times every weekend across the world. Usually it means someone goes home disappointed, sleeps it off, and lives to party another day. For Karl Clemente, it became a death sentence. His friends were already inside when the rejection happened. In the chaos and noise of a crowded venue entrance, communication broke down. By the time one of his friends emerged to check on him, Karl had vanished into the Brooklyn night. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery and speculation. The industrial wasteland of East Williamsburg at night is a disorienting place. Warehouses casting long shadows, streets that seem to lead nowhere, the distant hum of traffic mixing with music pulsing from various venues. Karl, possibly disoriented, possibly trying to find his way home or back to his friends, began to wander. Surveillance cameras and scattered witnesses would later piece together fragments of his movements, but the crucial minutes remained lost to darkness. Somewhere in his wandering, Karl's path took him toward Newtown Creek, a murky industrial waterway that separates Brooklyn from Queens. Newtown Creek is not the kind of place anyone would choose to visit. For over a century, it served as an industrial dumping ground, its waters polluted with oil, chemicals, and the toxic residue of Brooklyn's manufacturing past. The Environmental Protection Agency designated it a Superfund site, one of the most contaminated bodies of water in the United States. Its shores are lined with lumberyards, industrial facilities, and chain-link fences. At night, It becomes even more forbidding, dark, isolated, and utterly devoid of the safety and light of nearby neighborhoods. Yet somehow, Karl Clemente ended up at its edge. Days passed before Karl's body was discovered floating in Newtown Creek. The discovery sent shockwaves through his family and community. His father, Alex Clemente, rushed to identify his son, hoping against hope for a mistake, for any explanation other than the one staring him in the face. Near the water's edge at a lumberyard, investigators found Karl's wallet, his credit cards, and his identification, arranged in a way that suggested they had been deliberately placed there. The discovery raised immediate questions. Had Karl placed them there himself? Had someone else? Were they clues to what happened, or simply the random detritus of tragedy? The official ruling came down as accidental drowning. According to the New York Police Department's investigation, there was no evidence of foul play, no signs of assault or murder. The theory presented was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Karl, intoxicated and disoriented, had somehow made his way to the creek's edge and fallen in. The polluted waters and darkness made rescue impossible. But for Alex Clemente and everyone who loved Karl, the official explanation felt insufficient. "It's very difficult to have no closure at all," Alex told reporters, his voice heavy with grief and unanswered questions. "How does a person go from being turned away at a nightclub entrance to drowning in one of Brooklyn's most toxic waterways? The distance from the Brooklyn Mirage to Newtown Creek is walkable, but the journey requires navigating industrial streets with few landmarks, crossing areas with minimal lighting, and somehow deciding to approach a waterway surrounded by industrial facilities and warnings." Karl's friends tormented themselves with what-ifs. What if they had insisted on staying outside with him? What if they had called him an Uber immediately? What if they had simply decided on a different venue that night? But fate, it seemed, had already written Karl's story, and no amount of retrospection could rewrite those final hours. The tragedy of Karl Clemente's death extends beyond the loss of a single life, devastating as that is. It represented the first in what would become a disturbing pattern, a series of deaths that would terrorize Brooklyn's nightlife community and spawn theories ranging from serial killers to conspiracy. But before those theories took hold, before the full scope of what was happening became apparent, Karl's death stood alone. A young man who went out for a night of music and friends and never came home, his final moments lost to the darkness of an industrial Brooklyn night and the murky waters of Newtown Creek. His story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly celebration can turn to tragedy, how the thin line between a night out and a nightmare can be crossed in moments we'll never fully understand. Just weeks after Karl Clemente's body was pulled from Newtown Creek, Brooklyn's nightlife scene was rocked by another unthinkable tragedy. This time, the victim was John Castic, a 27-year-old analyst at Goldman Sachs whose intelligence, charm, and promising future made his death feel even more inexplicable. John represented the kind of success story that defines a certain segment of Brooklyn's population, young professionals drawn to the borough's culture while building careers in Manhattan's financial district. He was respected at work, beloved by friends and family, and by all accounts, living the life he had worked hard to achieve. On a humid night in late June 2023, John made plans to attend a concert at the Brooklyn Mirage, the same venue that had been Karl Clemente's last intended destination. The electronic group Zed's Dead was performing, and John was excited. He arrived with friends, ready for a night of music and dancing. For the first few hours, everything proceeded normally. The bass thundered, lights painted the crowd in brilliant colors, and thousands of people moved as one to the rhythm. But as the night wore on, John began to feel unwell. It's impossible to know exactly what he was experiencing, the heat, the crowd, the intensity of the environment, or something else entirely. Making what seemed like a responsible decision, John told his friends he was leaving early. He didn't want to ruin their night, and he assured them he would catch an Uber home to his apartment. His friends, trusting his judgment and not wanting to abandon the show, agreed. They watched him leave, expecting to hear from him the next day with a report of a good night's sleep and recovery. Instead, they would never see John Castic alive again. What followed his departure from the venue became the subject of intense investigation, analysis of surveillance footage, and ultimately, heartbreaking reconstruction of his final hours. Surveillance cameras captured John's movements after he left the Brooklyn Mirage. The footage shows him briefly entering a car, presumably the Uber he had mentioned to friends. But then, inexplicably, something changed. John exited the vehicle and began to wander the industrial streets of East Williamsburg. For over an hour, cameras tracked his path as he moved through the neighborhood, his gait suggesting disorientation, his direction without clear purpose. Investigators who studied the footage reported that John appeared confused, possibly lost, certainly not moving with the deliberate intention of someone heading home or toward any specific destination. The streets of East Williamsburg in the early morning hours are a labyrinth of contradictions. During the day, they're populated with warehouse workers, artists in converted loft spaces, and the rumble of trucks making deliveries. At night, especially after the clubs let out, they transform into a strange liminal space, not quite abandoned, but far from safe or well-trafficked. John Castic wandered through this landscape, his path eventually taking him toward the same grim destination that had claimed Karl Clemente weeks earlier, Newtown Creek. The surveillance footage showed him approaching the bridge that crosses the polluted waterway, and then he disappeared from view. Days later, John's body was found floating in Newtown Creek, in almost the exact same area where Karl Clemente had been discovered. The parallel was immediately and disturbingly obvious to investigators and the community alike. Two young men, similar ages, both at the same venue on different nights, both ending up dead in the same toxic creek. The coincidence seemed too perfect, too planned, to be random chance. But the official investigation found no connection beyond tragic circumstance. The medical examiner ruled John's death a drowning, though the autopsy revealed the presence of ketamine in his system, a drug known for its dissociative effects, which could explain his disorientation and wandering. John's father struggled to process the loss and the circumstances surrounding it. "My son was a good-looking, intelligent young man," he told reporters, his voice breaking with emotion. "People not only liked him, they respected his opinion." The statement captured the essence of who John Castic was and the magnitude of what was lost. This wasn't someone prone to making dangerous decisions or taking unnecessary risks. This was an accomplished professional who had presumably made a rational choice to leave a venue where he felt unwell and go home. How that decision transformed into a death in Newtown Creek remained a question without satisfying answers. The presence of ketamine in John's system opened additional lines of inquiry and speculation. Had he taken the drug voluntarily? Was it administered without his knowledge? Ketamine, commonly known as Special K in club environments, produces effects that include disorientation, detachment from reality, and impaired judgment, all of which could explain John's wandering and his ultimate arrival at the creek. But it didn't explain the larger pattern that was beginning to emerge, the disturbing repetition of circumstances that made investigators and the public wonder if something more sinister was at work. In the aftermath of John Castic's death, the Brooklyn nightlife community began to change. What had once been carefree partying now carried an undercurrent of fear. Social media exploded with theories, warnings, and advice. Groups of friends made pacts to never let anyone leave alone, to track each other's locations obsessively, to treat every night out as a potential danger. The Brooklyn Mirage found itself at the center of unwanted attention, its reputation as a premier entertainment venue shadowed by its connection to two tragic deaths. But the question remained unanswered. Were these deaths truly accidents, terrible coincidences in a city where millions of people party every weekend? Or was something else happening on the streets of Brooklyn, something that authorities either couldn't detect or wouldn't acknowledge? By the time Divino Nicholson's story entered the narrative, Brooklyn's nightlife community was already on edge, already whispering about patterns and dangers and the possibility of a predator stalking the borough's industrial party districts. Divino, whose name means divine or heavenly, was a 27-year-old man whose life embodied both struggle and aspiration. He had served in the army, an experience that shaped his discipline and worldview. He had played drums in church, his rhythms providing the heartbeat for worship and community gatherings. His mother, Desiree Nicholson, remembered him as very lovable, very lovely, a son whose presence brought light to those around him. Divino's connection to the unfolding tragedy came through his visit to an area near the knockdown center, another popular entertainment venue in the industrial corridor of Brooklyn and Queens. Unlike the Brooklyn Mirage, the Knockdown Center occupied a converted factory space in Maspeth, Queens, but it shared the same industrial aesthetic, the same late-night electronic music scene, and increasingly, the same ominous reputation. What exactly brought Divino to the area that night remains unclear. Investigators and his family never established definitive details about his plans or intentions. What is known is that his night out ended not with a safe journey home, but with another body discovered in Newtown Creek. The discovery of Divino's body marked a terrifying escalation. 3 young men, all in their 20s, all connected to the same nightlife scene, all found dead in the same polluted waterway within the span of a year. The statistical improbability of such a coincidence fueled speculation that reached fever pitch on social media. TikTok videos analyzing the deaths went viral, accumulating millions of views. Reddit threads stretched to hundreds of comments, with amateur detectives piecing together maps, timelines, and theories. The prevailing narrative that gained traction online was chilling. A serial killer was stalking Brooklyn's nightlife scene, targeting young men, and authorities were either incompetent or complicit in covering it up. But the official findings told a different story, or at least a more ambiguous one. The medical examiner who performed Divino's autopsy could not determine a definitive cause of death. Unlike Karl Clemente and John Castic, whose deaths were ruled drownings, Divino's case remained officially undetermined. This ambiguity only intensified the speculation and fear. If he didn't drown, what killed him? Was there evidence of foul play that investigators couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge? The lack of closure, the absence of clear answers, made Divino's death perhaps the most disturbing of the 3 connected to Newtown Creek. Desiree Nicholson found herself thrust into every parent's worst nightmare, not only losing a child but losing them under circumstances that made no sense, that provided no narrative to cling to, no explanation to offer closure. She struggled, as any mother would, to reconcile the son she knew with the inexplicable circumstances of his death. Divino had survived military service, had navigated the challenges of young adulthood, had built a life of purpose and connection. For that life to end in the murky waters of an industrial creek, with no clear explanation of how or why, felt like a cosmic injustice, a violation of the basic order that lets parents believe their children will be safe. The neighborhoods surrounding the nightlife venues and Newtown Creek became the subject of intense scrutiny. Residents reported strange occurrences, figures lurking in shadows, cars driving slowly through industrial areas, the general sense that something was wrong in their midst. Some of these reports were doubtless fueled by media coverage and public panic, the kind of heightened awareness that makes ordinary occurrences seem sinister. But others came from credible witnesses who had lived in the area for years and insisted that something had changed, that a malevolent presence had infiltrated their streets. Security companies saw increased business as venues hired additional personnel. Police increased patrols, though their public statements continued to deny any evidence of a serial killer or coordinated attacks. The impact on Brooklyn's nightlife economy was measurable and significant. Attendance at the Brooklyn Mirage and similar venues declined noticeably. Event organizers found themselves answering uncomfortable questions about safety protocols, about the industrial location, about the proximity to Newtown Creek. Some venues implemented new procedures, requiring groups to check in and out together, increasing lighting in parking areas, even arranging security escorts for patrons who felt unsafe. But no amount of precaution could address the fundamental question that haunted everyone. If 3 young men had already died under mysterious circumstances in the same location, who would be next? Divino Nicholson's death represented more than another tragic statistic. It symbolized the transformation of Brooklyn's industrial nightlife district from a place of liberation and celebration to a landscape of fear and suspicion. The drummer who had once kept time for church worship became a silent reminder that death can arrive without warning, without explanation, without the narrative closure that humans crave. His mother's grief, multiplied across 3 families and extending throughout entire communities, stood as testament to how quickly joy can transform into horror, how the streets we walk without thought can become the setting for inexplicable tragedy. And still, Despite investigations and media attention and public outcry, the essential mystery remained unsolved. Were these deaths truly accidents, or was something darker at work on the streets of Brooklyn? Not all unbelievable deaths on Brooklyn's streets stem from mysterious circumstances or unsolved questions. Sometimes, death arrives in a manner so absurd, so impossible to take seriously, that it challenges our ability to process tragedy. The death of 58-year-old Denver Lee St. Clair represents perhaps the most bizarre entry in this catalog of unexpected endings. On December 21, 2013, Denver died in a manner that sounds more like a dark comedy sketch than real life. He was killed by what investigators officially termed an atomic wedgie administered by his stepson. To understand the sheer impossibility of this death, we need to understand what an atomic wedgie actually is. The term comes from schoolyard bullying culture, representing an extreme form of the common wedgie. In a standard wedgie, a person's underwear is pulled upward, causing discomfort and humiliation. An atomic wedgie takes this to an extreme. The underwear is pulled up and over the victim's head, stretched to its absolute limit. It's the kind of thing that exists primarily in cartoons and juvenile imaginations, not something anyone would consider potentially lethal. But in the case of Denver St. Clair, the elastic waistband of his underwear became a murder weapon. The incident occurred during a domestic dispute in Denver's Brooklyn home, the kind of family conflict that sadly plays out in countless households. The specific details of what sparked the confrontation remain known primarily to those involved, but at some point, Denver's stepson decided to escalate the physical altercation in the most unusual way imaginable. He administered an atomic wedgie with such force and severity that the elastic waistband of Denver's underwear cut off blood flow to his brain and restricted his airway. The technical cause of death was ruled asphyxiation. Denver St. Clair literally suffocated because his underwear was pulled too tightly around his neck and face. The medical examiner who performed Denver's autopsy faced the unusual challenge of documenting this manner of death in official records. The cause had to be precise and medically accurate while also capturing the bizarre nature of the killing. The term atomic wedgie ended up in official documents, making Denver's death perhaps the only case in forensic history where a playground bullying tactic became an official cause of death listed by a medical examiner. The stepson was subsequently charged with murder, prosecuted, and convicted, though the trial itself became a surreal proceeding as attorneys attempted to discuss underwear elasticity, physics of strangulation, and the intent behind such an unusual method of killing with the seriousness required by law. Denver's death highlights a disturbing truth about human vulnerability. We go through life assuming that danger comes from obvious sources: weapons, vehicles, violent assaults involving conventional means. We develop strategies to protect ourselves from these recognized threats. But Denver St. Clair died from something that most people would laugh off if described hypothetically, something so absurd that warning someone about it would seem like a joke. His death serves as a grim reminder that human fragility is absolute, that even the most ridiculous circumstances can become lethal, that death doesn't always arrive with dignity or drama but sometimes with absurdity that makes processing grief even more complicated. The Brooklyn community where Denver lived struggled with how to respond to his death. Domestic violence is a serious issue that affects countless families, but the specific circumstances of this case made it difficult to discuss without inadvertently trivializing the tragedy. How do you hold a vigil or memorial for someone killed by an atomic wedgie without the event devolving into uncomfortable jokes or nervous laughter? How do friends and family members process their grief when the manner of death is so outlandish that recounting it feels disrespectful? Denver's death forced everyone who knew him to navigate the impossible territory between recognizing the genuine tragedy and acknowledging the undeniable absurdity. From a legal perspective, the case raised interesting questions about intent and murder charges. Can someone genuinely intend to kill another person with an atomic wedgie? Or was this a case of assault that accidentally became lethal, a charge more akin to manslaughter than murder? The prosecution successfully argued that the level of force required to cause fatal asphyxiation through this method demonstrated clear intent to cause serious harm, if not death itself. The defense attempted to portray it as a fight that went too far, a moment of anger that had unintended consequences. Ultimately, a jury decided that pulling someone's underwear with enough force to strangle them constituted murder, and Denver's stepson was sentenced accordingly. Denver Lee St. Clair's death stands as perhaps the most uniquely Brooklyn entry in this catalog, not because atomic wedgies are specific to the borough, but because only in a place as diverse and unpredictable as Brooklyn would such a death become part of the public record and collective memory. His story circulated widely, appearing in news aggregators, true crime databases, and countless strangest deaths compilations. In death, Denver became an internet curiosity, a footnote in weird history, a conversation starter at parties. But behind that bizarre legacy was a real person, a 58-year-old man whose life ended in his own home at the hands of family, in a manner that robbed him of any dignity in death. His story reminds us that tragedy doesn't always arrive with the gravity we expect, and that the streets of Brooklyn have witnessed not just mysterious or violent deaths, but deaths so strange they challenge our fundamental assumptions about how life can end. The streets of Brooklyn connect a vast network of buildings where millions of people live, work, and interact daily. Most of these interactions are mundane, forgettable moments that pass without incident. But on July 18, 2016, an altercation inside the Luzerne County Correctional Facility, a facility that housed some Brooklyn inmates, resulted in a death so dramatic, so cinematically violent, that it seemed scripted for a thriller rather than real life. The incident involved 25-year-old correctional officer Kristopher Moules and 27-year-old inmate Timothy Gilliam Jr., whose confrontation would end with both men plummeting to their deaths from a fifth-floor elevator. The circumstances leading to the fatal confrontation remain somewhat unclear, as is often the case with incidents that occur inside correctional facilities where surveillance and witness accounts may be limited or contradictory. What is known is that Kristopher Moules was on duty, performing his responsibilities as a correctional officer, when he had an altercation with Timothy Gilliam Jr., who was being housed at the facility as an out-of-county inmate. The specific trigger for their conflict, whether it was a disciplinary issue, a personal grievance, or an escalation of ongoing tensions, became secondary to the horrifying conclusion of their encounter. The fight between Moules and Gilliam intensified rapidly, reaching a level of violence that went beyond the typical altercations that occur in correctional settings. Both men were engaged in a physical struggle of desperate intensity, the kind where rational thought gives way to pure survival instinct and rage. In the course of this fight, they crashed into the exterior doors of a fifth-floor elevator. These doors, designed to withstand normal pressure and use, were not built to absorb the impact of two adult men locked in violent combat. The doors gave way catastrophically, opening onto an elevator shaft where no elevator car waited to catch them. The fall from the fifth floor was fatal for both men. Their bodies plummeted down the elevator shaft, striking surfaces and structures on the way down before reaching the bottom. The impact killed both Kristopher Moules and Timothy Gilliam Jr. instantly. Correctional staff and inmates who witnessed the aftermath described a scene of chaos and horror, the kind of traumatic event that leaves psychological scars on everyone present. In an instant, what had been a correctional facility going about its normal operations transformed into a death scene, with two men dead from a fall that should never have been possible. The investigation that followed examined multiple aspects of the incident. Why had the elevator doors failed? Were they properly maintained and inspected? Had there been previous concerns about their integrity? From a facilities management perspective, the incident raised serious questions about safety standards in correctional buildings. Elevator doors are supposed to have safety mechanisms that prevent them from opening when no car is present, and they should be strong enough to resist impact. The fact that two men could crash through them suggested either catastrophic failure of equipment, inadequate maintenance, or design flaws that put everyone in the building at risk. From a procedural perspective, investigators examined the altercation itself. What protocols were in place for correctional officers dealing with difficult inmates? Was Kristopher Moules following proper procedures, or had he engaged Gilliam in a way that escalated rather than de-escalated the situation? Should there have been backup present? These questions were not meant to assign blame to Moules, who was, after all, a victim of the incident himself, but to understand how similar tragedies might be prevented in the future. The investigation revealed systemic issues in how the facility operated, including understaffing and inadequate safety protocols. For the families of both men, the tragedy was compounded by the circumstances. Kristopher Moules' family lost a young man who was serving his community as a correctional officer, a difficult and often thankless job that he had presumably chosen out of a sense of duty or necessity. His death on the job, in such a violent and unexpected manner, left his loved ones with the kind of complicated grief that accompanies workplace fatalities. Timothy Gilliam Jr.'s family, meanwhile, faced the challenge of mourning a son who was incarcerated, whose death occurred in circumstances that would inevitably be colored by his status as an inmate and his role in the altercation that led to the fall. The double fatality sent shockwaves through Brooklyn's communities, particularly those with connections to the correctional system either through employment or through incarcerated family members. The incident highlighted the dangers faced by correctional officers, a reality often overlooked by the general public. It also raised questions about conditions inside correctional facilities and whether adequate resources were being devoted to maintaining safe environments for both staff and inmates. The elevator shaft deaths became a rallying point for union representatives and safety advocates who argued for better funding, better equipment, and better protocols in correctional facilities throughout New York State. Kristopher Moules and Timothy Gilliam Jr. died together, their final moments defined by violence and a catastrophic failure of safety systems that should have protected them. Their deaths on Brooklyn streets, if we count the correctional facility as part of the borough's urban landscape, remind us that danger exists in places we assume are controlled and safe, that institutional buildings are only as secure as their maintenance and design, and that human conflict can escalate to lethal conclusions with terrifying speed. The image of two men falling through an elevator shaft is the stuff of nightmares, a death so dramatic and violent that it seems impossible, yet it happened in a Brooklyn facility on an otherwise ordinary July day. The final story in this catalog of unbelievable Brooklyn deaths centers on an event that should have been nothing but joy, a wedding celebration. Weddings represent hope, new beginnings, the union of families, and the promise of future happiness. But in Brooklyn, on a day when one couple should have been creating memories to last a lifetime, gunfire erupted in the streets, transforming celebration into carnage. The incident occurred on a warm summer evening when a wedding party was leaving the reception venue, filled with the happiness and slight exhaustion that comes at the end of a long celebration. No one could have predicted that within minutes, the streets would echo with gunshots and screams. The shooting began suddenly, without warning or apparent provocation. Witnesses later described the chaos. One moment people were laughing, hugging, making plans to continue celebrating at after-parties, and the next moment shots rang out and everyone was running, screaming, diving for cover. The gunman or gunmen, accounts varied in the immediate aftermath, opened fire on the crowd of wedding guests with an intensity that suggested either targeted violence or the kind of indiscriminate rage that doesn't distinguish between victims. In the span of less than a minute, multiple people were hit, their formal wedding attire stained with blood. The street transformed into a scene more appropriate to a war zone than a Brooklyn neighborhood. Among the wounded was the bride herself, shot as she tried to flee or shield others. The exact sequence of events became confused in the chaos and trauma of the moment. She survived, but her wedding day, which should have been preserved in memory as one of life's happiest moments, instead became a source of trauma that would require years of therapy and emotional processing to address. Other guests were not as fortunate. The final death toll and casualty count varied depending on the source and timing of reports, but multiple people were confirmed dead at the scene or shortly after arriving at local hospitals. Brooklyn's emergency rooms, accustomed to gunshot victims from the borough's more violent periods, found themselves treating people in tuxedos and formal gowns, an incongruous sight that hammered home the senseless nature of the violence. The investigation into the wedding day shooting faced numerous challenges. First, there was the question of motive. Was this a targeted attack on a specific individual who happened to be at the wedding? Was it gang-related violence that spilled over into a civilian gathering? Or was it a case of mistaken identity, with the shooter targeting the wrong people or the wrong location? Dozens of witnesses were interviewed, but the chaos of the moment meant that accounts were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Some people never saw the shooter at all, only heard the shots and ran. Others claimed to have seen multiple gunmen, while some insisted there was only one. The investigation became a puzzle with too many pieces missing to form a complete picture. Second, there was the challenge of Brooklyn street code, the unwritten rule in certain neighborhoods that talking to police is unacceptable, even when you're a victim of violence. Some witnesses who might have provided crucial information refused to cooperate with investigators, either out of fear of retaliation or adherence to this code. This lack of cooperation hampered the investigation and allowed the perpetrator or perpetrators to potentially escape justice. The wedding shooting highlighted an ongoing challenge for law enforcement in Brooklyn and similar urban environments: how to solve crimes and protect communities when those communities are unwilling or unable to provide the cooperation necessary for effective investigation. For the couple whose wedding became a massacre, life after that day required navigating impossible emotional terrain. How do you celebrate anniversaries when your wedding is associated with death and trauma? How do you look at wedding photos, if you can bear to look at them at all, knowing what happened after they were taken? Friends and family members struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they were spared when others were shot, questioning split-second decisions that may have saved or endangered themselves and others. The psychological impact of the shooting rippled outward from the immediate victims to the entire extended network of people connected to the wedding. The neighborhood where the shooting occurred grappled with its own response. Residents who had lived through previous periods of violence felt a weary resignation, a sense that Brooklyn streets would never truly be safe, that progress in reducing crime was always temporary and fragile. Younger residents, particularly those who had moved to Brooklyn during its gentrification and Renaissance, experienced shock that such violence could occur in neighborhoods they had been told were now safe and desirable. The wedding shooting became a talking point in broader conversations about Brooklyn's identity. Was it the hipster paradise of artisanal coffee shops and craft breweries? Or was it still the gritty, dangerous borough of its reputation? The answer, of course, was that Brooklyn contained multitudes, including both trendy safety and persistent violence. Years later, the wedding day shooting remains one of Brooklyn's most disturbing incidents, not just because of the death toll, but because of what it represented: the violation of a sacred occasion, the intrusion of violence into a moment of joy, the reminder that in certain parts of Brooklyn, celebration and danger exist in uncomfortable proximity. The streets where wedding guests ran for their lives while wearing formal attire became a symbol of urban violence's unpredictability, its capacity to shatter any illusion of safety or normalcy. For those who survived and for the families of those who didn't, the shooting transformed what should have been a cherished memory into a nightmare that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. These 6 deaths: Karl Clemente's mysterious drowning after being turned away from a nightclub, John Castic's disoriented wandering that ended in toxic waters, Divino Nicholson's unexplained demise in that same creek, Denver St. Clair's absurd death by atomic wedgie, the elevator shaft plunge of Kristopher Moules and Timothy Gilliam Jr., and the wedding day massacre that turned celebration into carnage, represent the extremes of how unexpectedly life can end on Brooklyn's streets. Each story challenges our assumptions about safety, about cause and effect, about the nature of tragedy itself. They remind us that death doesn't always arrive with warning or logic, that the streets we walk every day contain the potential for the unthinkable, and that Brooklyn, for all its cultural richness and urban vitality, remains a place where the line between life and death can be crossed in an instant, often in ways no one could have predicted or prevented.